Slides. All right. So today I'm going to share with you a little bit about several projects that I've had ongoing really in some form or another since a year or two after I started back in 2015, 16, 17 through the present. A continuing focus of my work has been how best to leverage geospatial tools to better communicate to various stakeholders coastal impacts of climate change and specifically storm surge and how storm surge may be enhanced by sea level rise. So I'm going to show you a couple of tools that I've built over the years and describe some efforts that I've made to user test those and refine them. So first, I want to say a little bit about the framework that I've chosen to apply to all of my work in this area. And that is this idea of the hazardscape. Susan Cutter defines this as the interplay of social, political, and economic factors interacting separately in combination with one another and with the physical environment that create a mosaic of risks and hazards that affect people and the places they inhabit. So this perspective, yes, it puts the focus on the physical hazard, but also recognizes that the hazard only can become a disaster when you think about that natural event in the context of social, political, and economic factors. So primary goal of my work has been to consider how varying the dimensions of hazardscape representation in various geospatial tools for storm surge in Galveston, Texas affects risk perceptions and preparedness intentions. So in thinking of these hazardscape presentations for storm surge in Galveston, I'm working within this framework of various dimensions of representing storm surge. So this includes considering what impacts are presented, physical, social, political, or economic. The darker words are the things that I focused on thus far in my work. So looking mostly at physical and economic impacts, immediate or mediated impacts, or rather presentations. Mostly my work is in digital media, primarily maps and apps. Perspective, egocentric, like an AR-based presentation, or allocentric, like a more traditional top-down cartographic view. I work in both of those perspectives. And thinking about different spatial scales and extents, local, regional, or national. Consider all three of those, and temporal scale and extent. Most of the work that I do is prospective, looking at scenarios for future impacts. So here are some of the questions that I'm considering, really big picture across all the various studies I've performed recently in this space. How does the hazardscape become apparent to residents? For many, they learn about storm surge if they move to the area through conversations with friends or neighbors, acquaintances, coworkers. For others, it becomes very apparent when their first storm hits and water begins to rise on their street. But my hope is to provide a better understanding of the storm surge hazard prior to a storm event through some of these digital representations. And so in thinking about that, I consider what representations of the hazardscape might best meet different stakeholders' needs. And in so doing, I consider various aspects of what stakeholders might need to get out of a tool that I produce. Are they working for an emergency management agency and they need to perform some risk analysis or outreach through a communication project, or are they in the planning department for the city or the county? So how best can I create tools that are tailored to meet those needs? And then how do varying dimensions of hazardscape representation affect risk perceptions among the public and to some extent policymakers? So at what scales and extents and through which experiences and media can we best drive a recognition of the significant risks that storm surge poses for those living on the coast in the Houston-Galveston metro area. So since a lot of my work does deal with risk perception, I'll briefly define that here. It is not a formal risk assessment. Instead, risk perceptions, this comes out of the psychology literature, this idea of an intuitive risk judgment. It's more how you feel about a risk or a hazard. So when you think about storm surge, do you feel personally at risk? Do you think it's going to affect you negatively? What kinds of emotions do you feel in response to the idea of storm surge in your community? These things are what I am trying to get at when I talk about the idea of risk perception. And why is this important? Because risk perception has been shown in a number of contexts to really be essential to adaptive behavioral response to natural hazards. Without this feeling of being at risk, recognizing that risk, it's very difficult to plan effectively for storm surge or other hazards that threaten these coastal communities. Also, critically for my own work, it's easily measurable via self-report items, which is helpful in the context of running surveys or focus groups. So this is a model that I've relied on through my dissertation work and some other projects, Rothman and Pat, 2005. They looked at various factors that affect climate change adaptation. And central to their model is this idea of risk appraisal and risk perception. All right, so throughout these projects, then, I consider who the users are. It's critical to know who your users are if you're going to think about designing tools to meet their needs and how those tools might affect their understanding of hazards like storm surge and how they might respond to or update their beliefs about storm surge risk. So one factor that's really important there is prior hazard experience, but there are several others, including demographics, belief systems, mental models, some of those that I touch on in some of my projects. Spent a lot of time thinking about this here, how we can then take a better understanding of our tool users and prepare hazard information to best meet those users' needs by updating the content of that message and or its format. And then thinking about, again, the effects of that hazard information on tool users. Today, I'm mostly going to be talking about risk perceptions, but I also consider effects on causal beliefs and behavioral intentions. And throughout my work in this space, I have a strong focus on design and usability for the tools that I'm building. So I'm going to talk about two projects today. The first is an economic impact map that I prepared through a Texas GLO funded project. And the second is going to be a pair of augmented reality applications. The first of which is shown here, developed 5 or 6 years ago now using Wikitude. And then I'm currently working on a new version of this, which I'll say a little bit about towards the end. All right, so the economic impact map, the focus there is really on community engaged design. It's one of the first projects where I tested out a user-centered design framework for evaluation, testing, and development of these geospatial tools. So I'll say a little bit more about that. That project considered several dimensions of hazardscape representation, including physical versus economic impacts, regional versus national scale, and current versus future temporal scale of impacts. My augmented reality applications, my focus there really has been more on comparing egocentric versus allocentric views, cartographic, top-down, traditional interactive web map displays versus AR applications. All right, so let's talk first about the storm surge map that I prepared for the GLO. This came out of a project titled Evaluating the Effects of a Coastal Spine. The PI on that was Dr. Wesley Highfield, one of my colleagues down at A&M Galveston. I was brought in as a co-PI on the project to lead development and user testing of an interactive web map to communicate some of these local to national economic impacts of building a coastal spine. And for those who don't know, do any of those here in person or online know anything about the Coastal Spine project? No. So the idea is it was originally known as the Ike Dike. And after Hurricane Ike, one of our now emeritus faculty members, Dr. Bill Merrill, decided, this is really unacceptable for one of the largest metro areas in the United States to be so severely impacted by storm surge. We can do something about this. This is in some ways a solved problem. The Dutch have done great things here. For example, let's think about this, bring all of our resources at A&M and at other institutions to bear on it and come up with a plan. Start talking to the right people, start making plans. And so over the years, they developed what came to be known as initially the Ike Dike, then the coastal spine. The idea was the same, no matter what you call it. Extend the existing seawall, which was built to protect Galveston after the devastating 1900 storm, deadliest natural disaster in US history. Build at least 3,000 people, if not several times that. But extend that existing seawall down the length of Galveston Island and across Boulevard Peninsula, and install a floating gate of some sort here at the mouth of the ship channel that can be open most of the time to allow the significant ship traffic to pass through, but can be closed before a storm arrives to protect the Galveston Bay system from surge. Ideally preventing flooding like what you see here of homes, but also protecting the significant infrastructure present along the ship channel, primarily on the west side of Galveston Bay. So I worked with my colleagues on that project. They did the economic modeling, and we brought in some local to regional stakeholders, and we wanted to learn more about what kind of a tool would work best for them to better engage them with this modeling we did for economic impacts. So this is, as I said, one of my first forays into using an approach known as user-centered design, which since has become one of my go-tos for this kind of work. We didn't have funding for a true UCD process, which would have involved probably about 3 different focus groups, one at this needs assessment stage, another here prototyping, and then another to check in post-implementation. So what we did some informal needs assessment over email and through phone calls, held one focus group here at the prototyping stage, and then checked back in after we had implemented a lot of the changes requested at the prototype stage to see what people thought about the final version. So through our early conversations, as part of this, what I like to call modified UCD approach, we came up with some goals that we wanted to achieve for design of this tool. We wanted to show economic impacts at local to national scales. That was one of the main things that GLL wanted to come out of our funded project, not just showing damage to residential properties or how many petrochemical or other facilities along the Texas coast might be shut down for a certain period of time. That was important, but we wanted to model the economic knock-on effects of that nationally for things like gas prices and even effects in bigger picture on GDP. And so we'll just show effects of 2 different scales, local and then nationwide, and demonstrate the economic benefits of building the coastal spine. As we strongly suspected, and our work did bear this out, that building this structure, although costly initially, estimates now of, I think, up to around 15 billion with recent inflation, maybe even a little more. But despite that, after one or two big storms, it would pay for itself by protecting the area from losses that would be much larger than that expense. We wanted to provide linked views with policy relevant impact summaries, so something like a dashboard based approach. Simple, easy to use interface with high discoverability, and we wanted the design to be responsive so that we could easily take one product and have it transfer from mobile to desktop. So some of the challenges we encountered along the way: who's the user? So a lot of different people we wanted to keep happy here. The funder, GLO, our local and regional stakeholders, and even having national stakeholders we directly consulted with on the project. But big picture, long term, we were hoping, okay, can we engage some audiences at the national level, try to get buy-in from folks in DC and maybe even other influential states, so that we could show them, hey, okay, yes, you're not going to be directly flooded or harmed by a major surge event in Galveston Bay, but your gas prices for your constituents may go up significantly. So, that might be a serious and problematic impact for you. So perhaps it's worth, it's a national priority to fund this project. Simplifying complex and abstract impacts while retaining policy relevance. So I mentioned GDP earlier. Maybe for congressperson or certain wonks in DC or up in Austin, something like GDP is great. But for state and local government officials, certainly members of the general public, GDP, maybe not the easiest thing to explain. So we wanted to make sure we had some of those great summary indicators like GDP, but also some things that were more relevant to people, in their daily lives. Showing impacts over multiple spatial scales and time periods. Can be tricky to do while keeping things simple, and which brings me to my last challenge, limiting that interface complexity. We developed it in the ArcGIS JavaScript API. We used a couple of their off-the-shelf tools. We did a lot of custom stuff with some other JavaScript libraries for some of our gauges and charts, and used bootstrap.js for the layout. This was our first version, the point where we kind of deemed things good enough to engage stakeholders and get their feedback. Our local map, I think it looked pretty good, as you'll see in a couple slides. For the local product, our final version looked pretty similar to this first design. The national, though, turned out needed a lot of work. And that became clear quickly, as you'll see in our interactions with stakeholders. I apologize that I pulled this screenshot a little late, and this early version was no longer working for the actual map part of it, but it showed all 50 states and a summary of the impact on GDP at the state level. So technically it'd be GSP, or gross state product, but people don't really call it that, so we just called it GDP, whether we were talking about the US as a whole or each state. But we tried this line graph showing differences in impacts to GDP over time. Maybe not the most user-friendly way to do it. And lots of options for downtime. How long were the plants, the chemical plants and other facilities going to be down? What sectors are going to be impacted? What state do you want to look at? Lots of buttons, probably too many. Not a lot of text explaining what was going on. So we had a focus group to take a look at both the local and national products and give us some feedback as part of this user-centered design process. They looked at ease of use, effect on risk perceptions. We considered how their interactions with the tool might affect coastal spine support, the decision relevance of the tools. We asked them to consider that, and asked them about how well this tool communicated the regional and national effects of building the coastal spine. Some of our methods, we had training and evaluation scenarios that we asked them to complete. While doing so, we requested that our participants engage in a think aloud protocol. That's where the focus group participants would talk through what they were doing and why as they were interacting with our tool. We also used the NASA Task Load Index, or TLI, to evaluate how difficult our users found the tasks that we were asking them to perform. We also had some pre-post assessments for risk perceptions and coastal spine support, and a general kind of freewheeling post-task discussion. So I don't expect you to read all these. I know the text is small, but I wanted to give you a little peek at what our scenarios look like. So this is what one of the training scenarios looked like. We gave them some directions, said, click this button to set the scenario for a certain year, for a certain storm, and then for a certain city, and then tell us something about the gauge display in the map, how much damage is expected. There was an option, it still is an option, to filter by socially vulnerable areas. So that's something we asked them to do. And then we had some similar scenarios at the testing phase. Here, though, we gave less direction about where to point and click to get the requested information. And then we had national scenarios as well. Similar idea, less hand-holding. We asked them to switch over, though, to the national map tab and answer some questions about effects on the national economy. So we had 6 Houston Galveston area participants. As you can see, they're a pretty happy bunch. 2 city planners, 1 emergency manager, 1 Chamber of Commerce president, 1 property association president, and 1 coastal resource manager. So good mix. Looking at the pre-post results, we didn't see a whole lot of change. If I had to run this again, I probably would have chosen some different things to measure pre-post, because overall, actually, they're a pretty well-informed group. They already knew their communities pretty well, so they expected surge to cause a lot of flooding and a lot of damage in their communities. And using our tool didn't affect that much at all. Similarly, with support for the coastal spine, most of these community leaders, they represented or worked with communities that were likely to benefit a great deal from the spine, and they seemed to know that going in. Working with our tools, again, didn't really move the needle much on that. But I'm not necessarily counting that as a deficit for the tools, since support was already really, really strong for the coastal spine before they even started using the tools. All right, so this is where we start to see some of those challenges associated with the national map product that I mentioned a few minutes ago. These are those NASA task load index results for training and evaluation tasks. We knew the national map was a little rough, so we asked them to spend a little less time with it, because we didn't want to get bogged down there, but we did want to get some feedback because we wanted to produce a good product there. Also, our stakeholders were local and regional focused. So we wanted them to spend most of their time working with local impacts, but did want feedback on national. And we found that, yeah, it took them a lot more effort overall to complete the national task as compared to the local tasks, and the training tasks, as expected, were easier because they were given more guidance. So looking just at that national task, we see pretty high scores for the effort and frustration portions of the NASA TLI scale. So this signaled to us we had some work to do. The informal feedback also bore that out. They had a lot of positive things to say too, and I'll get to those in a minute, but these were some of the more helpful comments actually that they had on the national map in particular. Keep it simple, too confusing. Tell me how much gas will cost. Chart and graphs not helpful. Another participant said that they didn't intuitively understand some of the charts. and they needed some clarification on what was being displayed. Related to that, perhaps this request for better directions. Reading the chart and map key was confusing, hard to understand the results and what it means. So, again, we had some work to do. Overall, though, especially when looking at the local map, our respondents did say, big picture, yes, the interactive web map and associated tools were fairly easy to use, but there was a need for better directions. Did seem to be useful for communicating benefits to the coastal spine. That's a positive. They thought it could inform decision and policy making. That came out of our informal discussion. It seemed very positive on that. They also highlighted that it could potentially be useful for public education, which was not a use case we had considered previously, but we did following our interactions with the participants. And yeah, and then they highlighted again, national impacts is too confusing and too abstract. And one of our participants pulled out that whole, picture being worth 1,000 words and said, well, yeah, visualization is worth 1,000 words too. So, I appreciate that. I think a good map or a good geovisualization can effectively communicate what otherwise would take a lot of words to get across. So that was good to hear. So we took that feedback and used it to update and I think greatly improve the products. We added a splash screen for directions to both the local and national impact tabs. And especially the national map, we simplified the charts a bit. Instead of a line graph, a simple bar graph. And the line graph we'd initially used because we wanted to show some of that change over time, because we did have data for economic impacts beginning in, at the time it was year 1, 2017, all the way out to 2066. But we thought, okay, well, if we want to display this information, maybe let's just put a slider at the bottom. And if the users are interested in exploring different years, they can scrub back and forth across that slider. And then the map also updates to match the chart as you do that. So this is what the final product looks like. This is the local view. Show the local impacts in 2 different ways. Expected property damage, estimated losses by census block group. Total damages sums up all the damages in the visual extent. So if you zoom in, it'll adjust accordingly. Similarly, over here, if you switch the view to flood depth, you get this summary of flood depth, average flood depth in the current map extent. And lots of options to filter by city, by socially vulnerable areas. So lots of options, but we try to keep the complicated stuff kind of hidden away under some menus. So if users just want to quickly point and click, explore, maybe zoom in on their house, they can do that without encountering a lot of the complexity that is here in the tool. You can turn the coastal spine on and off to compare the scenarios with and without coastal spine. And then also look at different storm scenarios here under the hurricane surge severity option. For the national tab, these options over here to look at different storms and scenarios remain the same, but now you get options to filter by state. And you can view impacts not just on gross domestic product, which we summarized as economic activity, to clarify things a bit for those who don't speak Econ 101. But then we also added easier to grasp everyday impacts like difference in gas prices that's expected for a storm with 2 different scenarios, with and without building the coastal spine. So You can see under this particular scenario, without the coastal spine in place, gas prices are expected to go up quite a bit more than what they would with the spine built. Okay, so some lessons from this work. As I said, this is one of my early attempts to use the user-centered design process. Where we're doing this project again, I would probably engage even earlier with our stakeholders and more deeply, perhaps find the funding to do 2 or even 3 in-person workshops instead of just the one. Also, the importance of matching tool complexity to use cases appropriate for the map scale and level of aggregation. Saw some challenges associated with that, especially at the national map. And yeah, this idea of reducing complexity in data interface and visualizations, especially when you have lots of other dimensions that you're trying to display, like impacts over multiple years, multiple geographic levels, local, state, or national. I have to choose some places to reduce the complexity, and it's the temptation for me is always to show more, but sometimes showing less is a better approach. So for more on this project, you can take a look at this article that I wrote with my colleagues on the project, published in Journal of Maps a couple of years ago. All right, so now a little bit more on my augmented reality projects, which, like that interactive web map, deal primarily with communicating storm surge risk in the Galveston area. So I'm going to talk about 2 projects here. My first was an attempt to use the Wikitude platform, which is no longer supported, to create a marker-based approach for communicating storm surge impacts. And my second project, which began development on this summer, is using ARKit. And I'm still deciding actually on what sort of an approach I want to use to visualize storm surge impacts on the ARKit platform. So why augmented reality? Part of me just wants to say, well, because it's cool, but there's more to it than that. There's been some good research showing that AR tools can enhance sense of presence and provide a more immediate and immersive view of hazards. For hazards work in particular, it's really nice because it can show invisible concepts or events, things like a storm surge event that may only happen every decade or 2 on the Galveston coast, at least a large one, but it can make it visible on the landscape in a way that is not really possible otherwise. You can kind of, if you have a good imagination, think about what a surge might look like if you're looking at a map display, and then from the map to, up to maybe out your window, down your block if you live on Galveston. But if you lack a great imagination, AR tools perhaps can help you get a better sense of what the impacts might be like. Consistent with that, there's been some research suggested that AR tools in the educational context can enhance situated learning by providing concrete, context-rich, embodied, and authentic learning experiences, and also by enhancing a sense of engagement and flow. So I had a couple of research questions that I wanted to explore with this first AR project using the Wikitude platform. The big question was whether AR tools, compared to maps, can reduce the psychological distance of coastal flooding and thereby drive engagement and preparedness, especially for those without direct experience. For those who've already lived through a storm surge event on the Galveston coast, they probably don't need too much convincing. They can have a good idea of what surge might look like when coming up the storm sewer, down their street, maybe even into their homes. But if you haven't experienced that directly, maybe an AR tool can help serve as a substitute for that kind of direct experience of the hazardscape. So the way I operationalized that big question in my study for the Wikitude tool was I asked whether augmented reality presentations of storm surge heighten risk perceptions relative to baseline pretest levels, and then also map-based representations. So this again is what that Wikitude-based tool looked like. Very simple. I kept things simple intentionally because I wanted to do something that would allow me to set up a comparison between the AR tool with its egocentric perspective and allocentric map-based view, and then also a table-based control. So in all three of those different presentations, I had the same, there are stick figures here. When the user launches this tool, they're prompted to enter their height, and then the projected surge heights are adjusted on the stick figure relative to the height of the self-reported user height. So, if you said you were about 6 feet high, 2 feet of surge might look about like this, maybe 1.5, 2 feet might look about like that. Whereas, for this building back there, maybe that's about 3 feet of surge, a little less than 3 feet of surge. So in this case, the person must have been a little shorter than that, because for this building here, it says flood depth 1 to 2 feet. This is actually the building that my office is in, down in Galveston. Pretty nice building. If y'all ever want to come down and visit, you're welcome to. So I already mentioned the platform, Wikitude for iOS. As I said, it's not supported any longer, but it was a JavaScript-based platform, which permitted development using CSS and web-based languages, which was nice because I already had experience with JavaScript, CSS, things like that. The data on the back end for this rasterized AdCirc modeling for flood depth under 6 surge and sea level rise scenarios. So storm surge for Hurricane Ike and some different permutations of what Hurricane Ike could have looked like if it were a little stronger or came in a slightly different location. And then also considering those same Hurricane Ike surge scenarios, but adding on, I think it's 2.4 feet of sea level rise. What I did was I decided to sample the flood depth from the AdCirc rasters within the building footprints for the A&M Galveston campus. And I also did the calculation just for all of Galveston, but my survey that I ran was for the A&M Galveston campus. So that's what we'll be looking at today. And I already described the construction of the markers. That was done in SVG, which allowed me to dynamically alter the vector-based display based on user height. So some of you might have been wondering, well, what happens if the surge depth is over the self-reported height of the user? I had a little triangle on top. This is a really bad day. You don't want to be this person. You don't want to be there. This is surge level 2 feet over your head. So that's what it looked like for extreme scenarios in unfortunate locations. So as I alluded to, I ran a student survey to test this. The purpose was to look for change in risk perception following exposure to either the AR tool, the map-based presentation, or the tabular presentation of this storm surge information. I did this using a Qualtrics survey of A&M Galveston students. I ran it twice, actually, once in April 2018, again in April 2019, with slightly different locations and slight adjustments to the map and table tools to account for some things that I thought might have been skewing the results. I don't really go into that in this talk so much. It turns out those things didn't matter much. It was a pre-post design measuring risk perceptions and preparedness intentions and a couple of other things before and after they saw the AR map or table presentation. And our respondents were randomly assigned to one of these 3 presentations. We had 78 students participate for extra credit. So thank you to the faculty who agreed to provide extra credit for students who who took some time to complete the survey. So this is what those table, map, and AR views look like for the survey. This was our first location. This quad here actually doesn't look like this anymore. They're building a new engineering building. It's like right here. I think it's going to be nice, but the green space was nice too. The building's probably going to be, we need the space. We got a lot of engineering students coming down to Galveston these days. So, yeah, so as you can see, under some scenarios, search was pretty bad here. We didn't really have any locations where I had to add little hats that were included as part of the survey. So no spots unless you were really short where the water was actually going up over your head. For the second run of the survey, I shifted to a different quad closer to the gym, but very similar results there. Yeah, and you can see in the map view and the table view, same markers, also adjusted based on user height. So the only difference was the perspective and whether or not there was the geographic context. So the geo context in these two markers same throughout. So that allowed me to kind of tease out what's going on here. Did any of these things have an effect on risk perceptions? And the answer was, well, not so much. Some of the question I asked was how much risk or danger from storm surge flooding do you feel on a 1 to 100 scale? And then I looked at the pre-post change in that. Across all the presentations, whether they saw AR map or table, they all increased their risk perceptions at least a bit on average. However, I didn't see any significant differences across the AR map or table views. If anything, the map and especially the table views seem to produce a larger shift towards higher risk perceptions. And I have some thoughts about that we could talk about during the Q&A if that's something you're interested in. But the main finding here was no significant difference, actually. However, because I wanted to give all the respondents a chance to at least take a look at the AR view, for those assigned to the map and table views, at the end I said, okay, you've completed sort of the formal pre-post randomly assigned portion of the study, but here's the AR tool. Take a look and let me know what you think after looking at the augmented reality version of this data. And then I asked them a couple questions about that. So now that you've seen the AR view, how do you expect your answers to these earlier questions might have changed? And my respondents seemed very eager to say, oh, I would have increased my risk perception response and increased the likelihood of assessed likelihood of property damage on campus and the likelihood that I would have evacuated. So I don't know if they were just really eager to try to please me by saying that, oh yeah, I definitely with the AR view would have answered in a way suggesting higher risk perception or higher likelihood of doing these things. Or if they maybe just really wanted to like the AR view, but if perhaps there were some things holding them back from really engaging with it, and that was kind of evident in the more controlled setting earlier in the study. So that's kind of the conclusion I drew here. It seemed like my users really wanted to like the AR view. It's also based on some of the just informal feedback I received, but it didn't. In the testing pre-post with random assignment, increase risk perceptions or behavioral engagement. So kind of a mixed bag. Informally, feedback from my users suggested that poor tracking of the geolocated markers when moving the iPad device might have limited engagement somewhat. Also, the fact that we saw somewhat lower risk perception change for both AR and map views suggests to me that perhaps there's something about geolocated data that is lowering risk perceptions here. And again, I can speculate more on that during the Q&A. But if you're interested in reading more about it, you can take a look at my 2022 publication in Journal of Environmental Media on climate change communication more generally. But one of the examples cited and discussed in that article is this study. So in response to that, and in response to the fact that Wiki2 is no longer supported, I've decided to move to a more robust AR platform and update my approach to representing storm surge flooding in augmented reality. So I've moved to Apple ARKit. And this is a couple of screenshots from the ARKit tutorial for setting up a simple demo app. I got this up and running on my iPhone this summer. And I got to the point where I needed to start making some design decisions. And that's kind of where I still am. I'll show you some examples in a slide or two of what I'm doing to plan for this this presentation via ARKit. Some advantages that ARKit offers over Wikitude and some previous gen platforms. At least for certain areas, you get much more precise geo-tracking. Along with that, you can get ground coordinates or 3D building features identified at tapped locations, faster and better 3D support, and importantly, compared to Wikitude, it's still supported, and it's free, which is great. Limitations, iOS only, and that precise geo-tracking that I mentioned is not yet available outside of major metro areas. So it works for me up where I live on the southern side of Houston, but not where I work down in Galveston, not just yet, which is a significant limitation for this work, but I'm hoping that support is built out soon. Some of the planned features for the application, I've thought a little bit more actually about the back end as opposed to the visualization that I want to use. I'm still trying to figure that part out, but developed in Swift, probably with the PHP server backend for some GDAL queries. Same scenarios, at least initially, same ad cert flood scenarios. And then design and sampling, this is what I'm still kind of playing around with. Probably I want to let the user tap the ground to get flood depth at a specific location, or tap a building to get flood depth in that building footprint. So limit the information displayed to specifically requested locations. And I'm going back and forth on whether or not I want to still use a marker-based approach or move over to a 3D surface, which presents some opportunities in terms of engaging the user, but also can be challenging because you have to deal with things like occlusion of objects in the scene. Which brings me to next steps. So I'm right now involved surveying design of existing AR flood tools, seeing what they do well and maybe not so well, and thinking about how that can inform development of this ARKit application. Looking to acquire some new hardware at some point to better support ARKit, and then I'll move forward with updating the prototype that I've been working on here and there over the last few months. So as part of my consideration on how to design the tool, I've been doing a lit review through Google Scholar. Goal is to identify trends and gaps in the literature and see if there are any opportunities for applying some of the cartographic design principles that I was trained in as a geographer to improving the AR display of some of this storm surge data. So looking just at AR tools for flooding generally, the Google Scholar search terms I've been looking at returned around 2,000 results, but a surprising number of those simply discuss the potential for AR in this space without actually developing a tool. But I did look at a number of tools or a number of articles that did describe tools that they've developed, and I've been working on categorizing them based on the visual variables that they use to display flood information, as well as the dimensionality of their display. So most of the tools do use volumes or surfaces. There are still a few marker or point-based displays. And there's also this one, which I thought was kind of cool, which actually uses lines and puts lines on the side of a building interactively in a way that's similar to what you would see with high water marks after a storm. I kind of like this because it lets you see multiple scenarios simultaneously. So I'm still kind of working through this lit review and thinking about what others have done to inform my own work with ARKit. You can see that so far, most of the work I've found has used volumes, mostly with color to show flooded areas. Height, as you would expect, is also frequently used. So I'm going to think about what other design methods, again, informed by my work in cartography, might be useful here. Potential for some linked views, similar to the interactive web map or the dashboard that I discussed at the beginning of the talk today. I think there's a lot of potential there to add more to a traditional augmented reality display. I need to refine the lit review, potentially looking beyond simply flooding to see if there's work that's been done for other hazards that might be relevant here and might inform my design. Okay. Last slide. So bringing things full circle back to this idea of hazardscape representation and two of the questions that I started off the talk with today. What have I learned about these questions? How might I answer them? Well, what representations of the hazardscape best meet stakeholder needs? Well, looking at map and AR-based presentations, I found both have performed pretty well in my user testing. The challenge really that I've come to appreciate is that you really need to work to match stakeholder needs to tool design to measures of tool effectiveness. And so I've alluded to repeatedly, this user-centered design approach I found can really help with improving that alignment. On the second question of how varying dimensions of hazardscape representation can affect risk perceptions, thinking specifically about my work on that AR versus map-based presentation project. I found no difference or no significant difference in the effect of the AR and map-based tools. Both increased risk perceptions, but neither seemed to do a better job of it really than the other. And so what I want to explore going forward is if perhaps I can get different results here if I produce a more immersive AR experience for my users. So that's what I have up ahead, at least in the AR space. Here are my references for the talk today. My contact information. Please feel free to email or reach out if you have any questions that we don't have time to cover today. But with that, I think we have at least maybe 5 minutes or so for questions. Thank you. Coming. Yeah.
You measured stakeholder, like how they would respond after using your tools.
Mhm.
Did you do any kind of measurement of what they could have learned from your tools? Or like any education aspect of that your tools provided?
Right, whether they learned some like physical geography concepts or
or like for the like how much the gas prices would have increased or
okay, I see.
Based on like a spine or something like that.
Yeah.
For about
right. Not directly, no. As I mentioned, some of my stakeholders for the workshops for the interactive web map for economic impacts did note the potential for educational applications of the map. But it's not something I tested directly in my workshop or via student survey. I guess on the student survey, I did ask them to answer some informational questions about how much surge or which building would be most at risk and things like that, and looked at the accuracy of their responses. I found that overall they were pretty accurate, and I didn't see really much in the way of difference between the different formats. Any other questions? Yeah, Dylan.
So the map you showed in the first half.
Yeah.
How did you get those numbers? Those water depth, for example, or how much the economic damage is?
Yeah, so the water depth itself was from AdCirc modeling. I believe some of that came from our partners at Rice University. They helped us develop the AdCirc model results for the scenarios. The economic impacts, those were based on, so it's primarily residential properties, at least for local impacts, and then looking at on a parcel by parcel basis, the expected water level, and then the property value. And I think we used the depth damage curves, but you'd have to look at, I'd have to look at the some of the other articles that came out of our work on that project, produced by other members of the team, to look at the details of their economic modeling approach. Yeah, I don't, because I wasn't involved in a lot of that. They just brought me in to make the maps.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Any online question?
Oh, yeah.
Online
What? Let's see. Don't see anything in the chat. So I think we look good. All right. Okay. Thanks all. Appreciate it. I mentioned that I have some speculation about why folks who were shown the maps or the AR-based views might have had slightly lower increases in risk perceptions from pre to post. In line with some other research and literature, I think that it may be related to tendency of people when they have that geographic context to consider things like, oh, well, the water's high here, but I know I can like escape this way, or I can go to the third floor of that building, or I can climb that tree.
Mm-hmm.
So adding that context, I think, allows people to, consider ways in which they could, still maintain their safety in a high risk environment, but that the context is absent. And something like the table view, they just see, water's high on all the people. That's really bad. That's a bad day. So I'm not for sure on that, but there's been some other work that some former colleagues of mine at Penn State did in the virtual reality context that suggested something similar. So
the test you run, the statistic test you run, that one didn't show any significance. But your coworkers, like the people you know from Penn State, do they have significant different?
Yes, so they actually found that their VR-based respondents had significantly lower risk perceptions.
Lower?
Yeah.
Oh, low.
Yeah. Yeah.
after you show them this is bad, it's actually lower risk.
Right, right. And their speculation was
Okay.
along the lines of what I was suggesting, that because it was a more immersive environment,
Yeah.
they were picking up on some of these details in the scene and thinking, oh, okay, well, this is bad, but oh, there's an escape route over there. I can, get out of danger in this way.